to confront the Tocqueville problem at last. All right, presenting on their chapter on the deadly bet are Eric Alterman and Richard Immerman.
Okay? It's on? Yeah. Thanks. No, it's not on? It's on, yeah. Thank you. No one has said this. I'm surprised. People always say, I'm very honored to be here in this group. I once gave the Lefebvre-Silby lecture at Cornell, and reception was held for me at Walt and Sandy's house afterwards, the students. And this is almost as good. So thank you very much. I also want to say, before I get to any substance, I may never get to any substance, but I want to say that writing with Richard has been a pleasure. And you may not know this. It's possible that someone did more work to put together this conference than Richard. It's theoretically possible, but I very much doubt it. And he did an incredible amount of work of a sort of bar mitzvah wedding. Now, I haven't said this to Richard before, and I'm going to embarrass him a little. I think when Richard, see, we were put together, the authors of these articles were sort of shotgun married. And I was told I would be writing about this book with Richard. We had never spoken. And I think Richard didn't know that I had a history PhD and was a professor at the time, because he put out a list of all the authors, and I was the only one that didn't have an academic affiliation and didn't have the word professor in front of my name. But
that was me, Eric. I did that.
Oh, you did that? Okay.
I would never have done that.
Oh, see, that kind of ruins my story, because what I was going to say is, Richard, thinking that I wasn't a historian, thought it would be wise for him to draft the entire article we're about to discuss and then turn it over to me, and I would polish it up a bit. And I want to point out that although my name appears first on the authors, and Richard asked me to talk, and I objected both times, I'm still here, and my name is still first, even though the article that I'm about to discuss was drafted by Richard, and maybe improved by me a little bit, but thank you for that. And I hope you'll thank Richard for that when we're done. I want to say a couple of words about Walt and my relationship with him, which was kind of interesting. So yeah, I was an undergraduate there, but we stayed very much in contact over the years. And I wrote my honors thesis on American Jewish intellectuals and the birth of Jewish neoconservatism, using 1967 war in Vietnam as my test cases. The idea being, after 67, the doves became hawks and became nymphs. It's not quite true, but anyway. People are still jealous of my thesis committee. It was Walt and Joel Silby and Ira. Am I saying that wrong? I am. I'm confusing Ira Katz-Nelson with Isaac Kramnik. Yes. What happens when you get to my age? It was Isaac Kramnik. And it was funny because I wasn't friends with Joel Silby. I was friends with Isaac Kramnik, though. And he came to me and he said, "You're writing about Jews with Walt?" And it's kind of a comment on Walt, the person. He was the least Jewish person I'd ever met. But it was also a comment on Walt, the scholar, because actually he was a very good person to write about Jewish intellectuals. Well, first of all, he knew something about them. But second of all, he knew how little I knew about the context in which I was operating. And when I told him what I wanted to write about, he said, "Well, first, son," he didn't call me son, but first, son, you better learn a little something about this country. And he had me do the first half of I spent 2 semesters on the thesis. The first half was all about American public opinion on the war, and the role of student demonstrations and so forth, which I had misunderstood. He paid for a lot of, using department funds, he paid for a lot of public opinion research so that I could compare from the Roper Center. I don't know if that still happens yet. And I mentioned that in part because he really wanted me to see the raw data and learn how to use that as an undergraduate, which is interesting. But I also mentioned that because I'm a professor at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York, and that is unthinkable at City University of New York. So we've all talked here a lot about how wonderful Cornell is, and in many ways it is, but I want to remind everybody that it's a different world than the one I teach in at City University of New York, which teaches over 250,000 students and is part of a public education in the United States, of which 77% of higher education students go to. And is really, people don't think about it much and don't seem to care about it. Media certainly don't care about it, but I care a lot, and the students that all I had to do was be a good student. But the students that I teach have to do an awful lot more than that, and I just like to remind people of that. Anyway, so yeah, Walt was a wonderful advisor and very demanding, and I've tried and failed to live up to his standards in my work ever since. And actually, the thesis I wrote would form the basis of my most recent book that came out in November, The History of the Debate Over Israel in the United States. And I saved my little note cards for 40 years and used them this time. And that is also somehow Walt's fault. And I just want to say one more thing about Walt, the scholar, that I don't think has come out as much as it should have in this conference, which is no criticism of the conference, but something I thought about. We've talked a lot about Walt as a sort of revisionist historian in the tradition of the Wisconsin School, focusing on economics and capitalism, which is true. But we've left out, and we've talked a bit about Walt as someone who was really interested in personalities and their role in history and how important they are, which is also true. We've talked less about Walt, although I think we all agree, as a historian of ideas. Walt was a great historian, but he was also a great utility player. He could play lots of positions. He had William Appleman Williamson, but he also had Richard Hofstadter in him. And I would even say he had a little bit of Robert Carroll in terms of his ability to sketch personalities in a way that made you feel like you knew who he was talking about. I remember the lecture about Brooks Adams. No other historian lectures on Brooks Adams. But his lecture on Brooks Adams was memorable, to say the least. Anyone else remember that lecture? And at the end of it, where he sings, "Goddamn, goddamn." Anyway, so this book, The Deadly Bet, I hadn't read it. Has anybody else read it? A few people have read it, yeah. So it's written for undergraduates, which also, the other thing, we talked about this last night, not so much today. A great historian, great guy, but really a great teacher. That's really what was most remarkable about him. There are other great historians, and there are other great guys, but I've never had, Richard and I say in the beginning of our thing, we've never had another teacher like Walt Lefebvre. And it's nice that we're closing with a book that is a teaching book, right? It doesn't break any new ground, as far as I know, on 1968. But it's a wonderful exercise in teaching, and it's so nice that at the end of his career, that's still what he was doing in writing as well as in teaching. We were told not to go over the actual text, so I'll try to avoid that. I will talk a bit about the Tocqueville problem, which is the main theme that Richard came up with for our essay. I was very pleased that he did that, because I had discovered the Tocqueville problem in an essay that Walter wrote when I was still in graduate school, I think, in a special issue of the Journal of American History, which was then published as a book in 1992 or 3, called Jeffersonian Legacies. And so in writing about Thomas Jefferson, he came up with this Tocqueville problem. And I wrote my second book, the one I dedicated it to Walt, on democracy and foreign policy. And I found back then, this book I think came out in the 1990s sometime. Cornell University Press published it, actually. And I found it to be an incredibly valuable organizing principle for the problem I was writing about, which is how can you have a democratic foreign policy? And the Tocqueville problem, as Walt defined it, see if I can find the definition here. Well, basically, Tocqueville came to this country, traveled around, and he was surprised at the relative level of democracy in that time and place, relative to the rest of the world. And he said, democratic governments appear to be decidedly inferior to others with regard to the conduct of foreign policy, because they find it difficult to coordinate the details of great understanding and to fix on some plan and carry it through determination. They have little capacity for combining measures in secret and waiting patiently for the result. So that's the problem. Now, that's always been true of U.S. foreign policy, that in order to have a foreign policy, in order to be in a position to have a foreign policy, you need to get elected in a country that knows nothing about the issues that you're arguing about. And you have to appeal to them. You have to appeal to their prejudices and to their ignorance, and at the same time carry out a policy that somehow works, even though it's not what they voted for. You have to sort of figure out what they want, despite the fact that they don't know what they're talking about, and somehow make it work so that they see you as a winner rather than a loser. Go on. Lefebvre calls this the Tocqueville problem in history. How, he wondered, can a democratic republic whose vitality rests on the pursuit of individual interests with a minimum of central government direction create the necessary national consensus for the conduct of effective and necessarily long-term foreign policy? Well, the book we're looking at, Deadly Bet, about the events of 1968, on the one hand, you could say that Lyndon Johnson's presidency was undone by domestic affairs. 1968 was a hell of a year. And, race riots and assassinations, George Wallace. But it's not, one thing this book does, and I think it's a really wonderful thing to do as a teaching mechanism for students, is it doesn't say there's foreign policy and there's domestic policy, and domestic policy affects foreign policy, and foreign policy affects domestic policy. It treats it all as one whole. It's organic, the relationship between foreign policy and domestic policy, and it becomes impossible to separate them. It's not that Lyndon Johnson's Great Society was done in by Vietnam. That's too simple. There's all these relationships between the foreign policy and domestic policy, and they play off each other, and they create their own dynamics that, again, are impossible to separate between the two. And I just want to make two observations about the essay itself, and then I hope Richard has something to add. First of all, it does that wonderful thing that we credit Walt with, which is paying careful attention to the personalities involved. We list the personalities here. William Westmoreland, Eugene McCarthy, Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, and Nguyen Van Tu as being, and he spends some time on each of their personalities and their roles and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, when I went to Cornell, 1978, I wrote a paper on the Congress of Versailles and the role of the personality of the Congress of Versailles. And I got a C+ on a paper in history. Never seen a C+ before, except in algebra in 8th grade. And the reason I got a C+ was because it wasn't history, it was government. It was because the professor said personalities don't matter. It's forces that matter. Why are you giving us this nonsense about the personalities of Talleyrand and so forth, and Bismarck? And that's wrong. That's just wrong. It mattered that George Bush was president rather than the winner of that election, of course. So he does this wonderful job, again, of integrating Williams and Hofstadter and Robert Caro and the institutionals involved in this short little book written for for undergraduates. I don't know who else could do that. I mean, I can't think of another historian who can do all of those things at once. And again, this is at the end of his career. The second thing I want to point out, and I'm not going to remind you of all these events, but you can probably remember them if you're a historian, you know them. But the second thing that Richard captured in his draft of the essay was this role of ghosts in American history, particularly with regard to race. But I want to use the word ghosts in terms of what we're living through today. The ghosts of 1968, the ghosts of the murders, the ghosts of George Wallace's campaign, the ghosts of the race riots, because that came immediately after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And our inability to make sense of our inability to reach any kind of consensus. Some of them were laid aside briefly, or put in the closet, so to speak, but never went away. And now we're living with these ghosts running rampant in our country in such a way that those of us who have been extremely critical of presidents in the past and U.S. foreign policy in the past could never have imagined it. I mean, what's happening today is beyond our previous imagination in terms of this country and a few other countries in the world. So I don't think Richard and I are stretching the truth too much to say it's kind of all here in 1968. You can find the precedents of what we're living with in 1968. Walt was not a prophet, but he was a very astute observer. And that allowed him to write about 68 in such a way that we can recognize ourselves today in it. And that's pretty good. That's it.
So can you hear me okay if I sit down? Well, thanks, Eric. That was great. And, I think you're being too modest. I did write the first draft, but Eric made it come alive. And that's a real talent that I've been striving for 50 years to develop. But the best way to do it is to co-author with someone who can do it. But the reason I wrote the first draft, and this is sort of my segue, is not that I doubted that you were a professor or you doubted, in fact, just the opposite. Hell, he'd written for The Nation. I said, he should write the first, the second, the third draft. But after I read the book, and when it first came out, and I'm going to come back to my debate with Anne and Andy as to which is the book that receives the least attention. So I read this book, which when it first came out, and it first came out in like 2005, 2006, I wasn't teaching much at that point. So I looked through it and then put it to the side and didn't go back to it. Then we got the assigned, and I actually asked to write about this. I was originally assigned Inevitable Revolutions, or that was the idea, and I said, hell, I'm the one who write all the biographies and doing that. I should be doing this book. So I read the book. It helped that it was shorter. But after I read it, I said, my God, this book is fabulous. This is incredible. So I wrote the first draft really because I couldn't wait to write the draft. This was telling a story, and it was surfacing themes and arguments that, I thought, this is just, it's going to write itself. So, and more than that, I mean, this was the book that did articulate and develop this concept of the de Tocqueville problem more than anything else that Walt had written, and yet we all knew about it. Again, going back to his classes, he would make reference, and here it was sustained. It was the book that focuses more explicitly and concentrates more on race than any other of his books. It was a book that, as Eric said, that demonstrates or argues that the boundaries between the domestic and the foreign are not only porous, but in many ways artificial, that we can't do it. It was a book that showed more than in terms of this, development of politics, going back to McCarthy, to George Wallace, and the polarization and all of the things that were going on and how they affected it. So what I want to do as far as question is, so I finished the thing and I write, and my question, I couldn't do, how did everybody miss this? Why? I mean, you talked about, how it, I found 3 reviews of this book, I think. One of them being in diplomatic history. We began by saying, and I was really surprised, all the people who said they had read it. As I said, I read it when it first came out, but I didn't know many people who had read it. And if they read it because they had assigned it, I think, for an undergraduate class. And yet, in my view, even though it was written for an undergraduate, and Walt acknowledges, David Anderson suggested that he write this as a teaching vehicle, this could easily be assigned to a graduate class. It is interest to public. So I guess it's a way to sort of, I was going to use the word catalyze, but I hate that word, that it's not a verb, but we made it a verb. But as a foundation or as a prompt for a discussion, for someone to explain to me why this book was missed. Why did journals not pick it up? Why is the Tocqueville problem, which I do think breaks new ground in a way. I mean, it's not out there as a part of our language and as a part of our literature. Why didn't it get more attention, and why didn't? I mean, I have theories now that I have developed, but when I was reading the book and drafting it, that was the first thing that came to mind, is that why am I reading this book as if I had never read it before, and why am I so profoundly affected by this book? And Ithaca, I think, was Frank, asked, do you think this is an important book? And I said, yeah, I think it's a really important book. And yet, as I say, that it was heartily reviewed. And it was his final book, and it's written the only way, only Walter Lefebvre could have written this book the way that he did, particularly based on, it's not prosopography, it's the mini biographies, the stringing together that tells a coherent story that goes through. So I guess I would start by, rather than me telling you why I think it is, that I'd really like you to tell me why you think this is. And Anne and Andy, if you want to tell me that I'm wrong and that the Clash was that. I mean, the Deadly Bet, I think it wasn't a band, but it's a great title, so it certainly could have been that. And he does explain and use the metaphor of a bet very explicitly and very effectively in the book, and that basically that Johnson bet wrong that he could resolve the Tocqueville problem, or that it really didn't exist. So, as a means of getting us into a discussion of a contribution that Walt makes that I think, I just can't exaggerate how important I think it is in terms of our understanding, and this whole idea, especially now that we're living in a time when, democracy has become so problematic in the United States and throughout the world. And that I would have thought if not then, now everybody should be reading this book, or the article, or I contributed a piece on Vietnam to a volume that Nancy Tucker and Warren Cohn had put together on the Johnson administration. Walt and I both wrote about Vietnam. I wrote, a pretty mechanical, pedestrian thing about decision making and all of that. And of course, wrote, Vietnam and the problem, the Tocqueville problem, and again, people didn't pick up on it in a way. And I can't really understand unless it's a problem with, who we are or what we're looking for or something. So please.
Well, Richard, we all wish we could have Walt back here to ask questions and say things to him. I wish he could have heard what your comment about the book is, because all I know is that in a letter to Lloyd, he really downplayed the importance of the book, and that he said he owed a favor to David Anderson, and he decided to write this book, which, that he made it sound like it was just like something he tossed off. Now, tossed off in a brilliant way, but that was Walt's assessment. The other thing I think maybe contributing to the fact that it didn't have wider circulation is the publisher. I think that may have contributed something to it.
Jonathan Gilman. Again, I guess my background is in government and at Cornell. And the Tocqueville problems that we had and our approach to Tocqueville was always twofold. One is he saying something that's perceptive? Sometimes he didn't. And secondly, if it's perceptive, is it unique to the United States? I think in this case, yes, it's perceptive. You need popular buy-in to maintain a war over an extended period of time. But on the second side, is it unique? I'm not so sure if outside of democracy, that problem does also exist, but in a different form. It's not elections, it's rather the elites start getting tired of the leadership above them, and they find ways of bringing an end to a bad set of policies. And for example, yes, we focus from our perspective on the whole era from World War II onward, Korea, which was at least a stalemate, Vietnam, Iraq, et cetera. Well, but if you look at Europe and you see the battle of empires between 1870 and 1950, you could see that it's a similar kind of thing. Yeah, they had parliaments, but basically they could sort of chart their course for a while until people and elites just got tired of where they were going. So I guess what I'm getting at is I think that, yes, this book is useful in meeting the first threshold of it's perceptive, and so is de Tocqueville. But it can go to a second step, and that's what, when I'm listening to a lot of today, I kind of wish it wasn't just about American diplomacy, that it was about diplomacy in the global sense, which is a lot of nations who sense that they're on the threshold of power are seeking aims through the diplomatic system. And we're not exceptional. We are like them, and that's a useful conclusion. But it's also useful to look at the other side and realize there are other actors that are often not democratic that are going from the same place. And we could use more comparison on that basis.
First of all, I think that it's a mistake to apply the Tocqueville problem merely to the problem of war and ending bad policies. The problem is, how do you sustain an intelligent foreign policy that meets the demands of the world at the same time as appealing to a public that has no understanding of these problems? It's quite similar, actually, to the problem laid out in 1925 by Walter Lippmann in Public Opinion. Lippmann compared citizens to a spectator at the very top of a stadium who didn't understand the rules of the game, didn't know who the players were, and was asked to make decisions about politics. He said, "We don't expect." Oh, I'm off here? No, but I'm on.
It's on.
He said, Lippmann said, you know, we don't expect people to know how to be lawyers without going to law school, or to be doctors without going to doctor school. Why do we expect them to understand politics? And he's mostly right. Now, he had a great argument with John Dewey that I've written about a lot. It's been sort of the foundation of my career, that argument. But I'm only really know what I'm talking about with the United States and a little bit with France. But they're very different, the United States and France, when it comes to the conduct of foreign policy. France has an elite which it's allowed to basically do what it wants in foreign policy. And whereas in the United States, you have to appeal to the public that you know it's really difficult. Right now, to give you an example, if you're a Republican politician, you are answerable to Fox News, and worse than Fox News, every day. Every day, your threshold is that day. And it's whatever Fox News and OAN and other horrible things, Tucker Carlson, wherever he is, are going to say that day. It's an impossible way to conduct foreign policy, okay? So it's an extreme version of the Tocqueville problem. As I said, we're living with the ghosts of what Walt observed in 1968. I don't think any other great power, and I could be wrong, because like I only know the United States and a little bit of France, but I don't think any other great power was forced to respond to the public in this way.
Not the public, but elites. I mean, for example,
elites make much, you know, they're better at this. They have bad values in a lot of sense. In my book on American foreign policy, I go back and forth between, on democracy and foreign policy, I go back and forth between Lippmann and Dewey, and I say, Lippmann is right that you can't conduct foreign policy democratically as Dewey would like. The solution to democracy is not more democracy. But the problem with elites is that once you become part of an elite, you develop a whole different set of values than the people you're sent to represent. Dewey, who's unreadable, he had great aphorisms. And he said, you can be the greatest shoemaker in the world, but only the man wearing the shoes can tell you where it hurts his feet. Okay? And once you join the elite and go to Washington and go to dinner parties and go on television, you lose touch with the people you were there to represent. So that's a big problem. But I think actually the problem we have now is worse than that problem.
Yeah, I was just going to say two things. And of course, in our field, we have been debating exactly what you brought up for at least 25 years. We had a whole forum in diplomatic history in which responding to criticism for marking time because we were too Washington-centric. And since that time, the field, as we've talked, has become much more international and transnational. But I don't know if you're suggesting that if you are like Walt and you still study state power and believe that the United States state, that there's no room for that book, that it has to be comparative. So, you know, that's sort of continuing. Gabriel Almond, a political scientist, you probably came up with this concept of the informed public as a way, I think, of sort of splitting the difference.
I forgot to mention, by the way, this is a small detail, but before I did this honors thesis with Walt, I did an independent study with him on Walter Lippmann. So my entire career, except for the Bruce Springsteen book, grew out of my study with Walt.
I think Bob had a question.
Well, no, the only point I was suggesting might be relevant.
Wait for the...
Thanks. The only thing that I was going to chime in with is that after I read the first draft, Richard, of what you had written, I had already read that book years ago myself, and I hadn't really taken it in and Walt being self-deprecating sort of reinforced that when I talked to him about it. But after in connection with my own work, I thought it would be relevant to go back and look at it. And I'm just wondering whether it's our time, you know, where things are spinning out of control, that makes the late 60s seem so relevant all of a sudden when they might not have when we first came across this book.
Yeah, that's my theory. That was going to be my next question, that if this book came out between 2017 and 2019, let's just say, whether the reception would have been quite different, and that goes back to what Anne was talking about, his sort of contemporary thing, except this time he timed it wrong.
So it's the perfect time for our essay.
I know, it is. You're absolutely right. In fact, I think we should reverse them, and we should be the lead essay, and then not the last one. And what that says in terms of our conversation of presentism, or maybe reverse presentism, that, what he was doing, but that's why I was so excited. I mean, I'm reading this thing, and he's writing about Wallace, and I'm thinking about Trump. And he's talking about, he uses terms like white backlash. He uses the term endless war. When this book comes out in 2005, 2006, yeah, I mean, we know that he's thinking about Iraq at that point, but he keeps it sort of in the back of the book. But it's not the Trump years. It's not the political sort of explosion that we're watching. And I don't think we were nearly as concerned with the breakdown in democracy, because if anything, democracy weathered the Iraq War really well, better than Vietnam in certain ways. So anyway, so that was going to be my follow-up, is that the thing? It was the time that it was written. Yeah.
On the matter of Walt being self-deprecating about the book, my story is that I wrote to Walt, it was probably the spring of 2006 or 7, and said, The Deadly Bet is at the top of my summer reading list. So maybe a little hyperbolic, but I was intending to read it, and I did. And he wrote back and he said, if that book is on the top of your summer reading list, you need a new list. But let me try something else on you. And I like the point about it being more kind of seemingly urgent or relevant now than it was 10 years ago. But I wonder if it's possible to put 1968 between covers ever by anyone. The events are so mind-boggling that I struggle to imagine anything other than a kind of novelistic treatment that could do justice to them, and maybe not even then. Lots and lots have been written about 1968. What's the best book you've ever read about 1968? Is there a really good one? There's this anecdotal one by Mark Kurlansky that is this kind of global survey of 1968, and you're just kind of ripped from one incredible scene to the next. You're in Nantes, and you're in Mexico City, and you're in Saigon, and it's just absolutely crazy. And I'm not sure it's possible to write crazy if you're also trying to be fair to the historical record. So maybe that's the failing of the book, if it's a failing, that certain subjects, certain years are not readily susceptible to nonfiction writing. Is that possible?
Spoken by someone who's writing a novel, so
Completely ducked out.
Well, I was thinking that I believe Walt assigned de Tocqueville's Democracy in America in the first half of the survey.
Absolutely,
right?
yep.
So as a teaching book, as Eric was saying, to me it fits in with his career of teaching, because he's still addressing this question of, can Republican institutions survive in an empire or a global power? And 1968 is a time when he can really, from the vantage point of the early 2000s, look back and say, this is when it went crazy, right? And here are the voices, the actors, the issues that made it so crazy, with that question in mind, right? Can it survive? And I think that's why it feels so timely now.
Yeah, I mean, the timeliness, I mean, I didn't go for my notes, but it is just so incredibly timely, and it's hard to imagine, assuming we survive, someone not writing a 20 book about now, 2024, my God, I can't even imagine how crazy it potentially could be. And also internationally in terms of this. So I don't know, but I say maybe because it was so crazy that I was just so, blown away writing this book, that he seemed to, with these vignettes, capture it better than certainly Kalansky did. My close friend David Farber with Chicago 68, which I think is a great book, but it's much more narrow. We talk about Days of Rage. I mean, all of the stuff that we read about the 1960s, which also is the problem for those of us who lived through it, to somehow separate ourselves from these history, not saying, well, they all got it wrong, because I'll tell you what happened to me, which is really hard. So anyway, I said I don't really have an answer, except I am firmly convinced that if this book were published, now or a couple years before, that the reception would have been much broader, and it would have been covered, and that the de Tocqueville problem would become much more central to the conversations that we have as historians of American foreign relations than it is, even now.
Just one quick follow-up. Not long after 9/11, Walt wrote this essay, a short essay called Bush, Tocqueville, and Miller. It was Arthur Miller. And it was a premonition. I mean, he gave the premonition when he gave the speech on the Arts Quad after 9/11. That this could be much worse than Vietnam. We're in a new century. There's talk about a new war, and so I think the Tocqueville problem was ever present in his mind, but especially after 9/11. And then he got to the last book, and in 1968, at a time when the Bush administration was headed into a quagmire, to use a word that Donald Rumsfeld didn't care for. And perhaps Walt was thinking more broadly about what the political consequences of that would be. Why the book didn't get noticed, there were so many other books written about American empire in decline or American empire on the rocks at that time that I think it was probably overshadowed. And Frank is probably right as well, that it depends on who your publisher is and how much air the book gets. So. But it is worth reading, and one of the things that's cool about it with regard to the Tocqueville problem is that the stand-in for Tocqueville in Deadly Bet is this British ambassador Patrick Dean.
Yes.
So Walt refers again and again and again to Patrick Dean, the British ambassador, watching all of this unfold. And in an eerie sort of way, Patrick Dean is kind of a reincarnation of Tocqueville. So it really is a well-written book, and it's well worth reading. And as Rich and Eric said, it's only 197 pages long or something.
I feel like I've developed an expertise in books not getting noticed in the past few years. And I think from a commercial perspective, from a perspective of regular media, there's no rhyme or reason to it. You can't make sense of it. It's just completely hit or miss. I think an interesting, a better question, although maybe the answer is contained in the intended audience of the book, is why didn't it make a bigger splash among scholars? But you can't really ever say why, unless you're, Norman Mailer or something. You can't ever say, why are people ignoring my book? Because 99% of nonfiction books are ignored.
Right.
And Walt was beloved by us, but not that famous in the world of commercial books.
Well, I guess the question I have goes back to one of our earlier discussions, and especially Lorena's comments about Walt's dedication to the role of the university and the centrality of reasoned debate and discourse as kind of the only way for a democratic society to govern itself. And which, that's also in the essence of the Tocqueville problem. But, but how does one actually make that actionable, right? How does that kind of a society come into being? And as we saw in the Beacon Theater lecture, and this is also a point he made in The American Age, we only have that one moment in all of U.S. history in the early republic when the political leaders of the United States and its intellectual leaders are the same people. And so, yeah, I guess that's kind of the question for all of us, but also in Walt's work was, on the one hand, he had this belief in knowledge and reason, but how was that to be made actionable?
How do you make it? You know, I worked in intelligence. We use that word actionable all the time, and we're never able to come up with it. I don't know how you do it, but I remember Andy at Ithaca suggesting that we pay more attention to pedagogy in the book and discuss how this really worked in terms of how he taught. So I don't know how ambitious he was, but I do think that he believed that if more people sort of thought and asked the types of questions that he would raise, that it would become somewhat actionable. And I think this conference, in a sense, manifests that, because look at the number of people who are here who went into public policy in some way or another, not coming out of a public policy school, and I think somehow try to actualize the notions that he taught. And it goes back to what Susan said. How many foreign policy courses assign Tocqueville? And where democracy is such a central part of his teaching, which again goes back to this book, why I thought it was so important, because it's all about democracy. And, you know, I think to all of us, it was important back then in Vietnam. It was important when he wrote the book. And I don't think it's ever been more important than it is today in terms of thinking about it. So, you know, to me, I just want to pay sort of more tribute to this guy who isolated what was so important to all of us, and which, you know, the realists, may they rest in peace, you know, don't want to pay any attention to at all.
Well, I think the short answer to your question is, sure, that's why so many of us have gravitated to university, because it's an institution that we respect because it speaks to the values we hold. But the short answer is, it's a conundrum, because the way to do what you're talking about is to create strong institutions and to have people follow the rules and mores of these institutions. But these institutions are often, because of what we were talking about earlier, in conflict with the democratic desires of the people that they're supposed to be doing their job for. One book that I'm pretty sure Walt assigned to me as an undergrad was The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked. So, by Richard Betts and Leslie Gell. And they make a very good case that everything worked exactly as it should have in Vietnam, because there was no role for democracy in the system. It's a compelling argument. So this is the Tocqueville problem. But actually, you could apply the Tocqueville problem to lots of institutions. You could apply it to IBM. You know, you could apply it to all different kinds of institutions. But we need institutions, and we need institutions that are somehow receptive to democracy. And we don't really know how to do that. So I think that Walt's Tocqueville problem is a wonderful way to focus our attention on this problem and try to do better both institutionally and democratically, knowing that we're never going to solve it.
I think that's a great way to end, really, today's discussion, leaving us with a problem to solve that Walt worked on for how many years? Looking at, you know, over 200 years of U.S. history, so we just will carry on, right? I think that's what we're going to be doing. I want to thank Eric and Richard very much for the deadly bet.
for those of us who know that, that we will sort of gather in the lobby at around 5:40, and we will then commence. So I would suggest that you be ready to go out and party after that. All right. So whatever you want to wear, but so 5:40 is the next juncture. So we have about an hour. And of course tomorrow is as a good point. I need Susan to keep me on track. So tomorrow breakfast is at 8, but it goes to 10. We start at 10 o'clock as the roundtables. I think we're all extremely excited, about those. Try to get here. I have an idea there's going to be a pretty good crowd in here because, they don't have to listen to us drone on. They get to hear the people who actually have something substantive to say. Then we'll have lunch, and then we'll have the afternoon where we get to do it again, and then a wrap up. So I want just to leave to thank everyone. This has really been a wonderful experience, at least for me, to hear from all of you. And, so thanks for a lot of hard work went into this, and, it's all turning out the way we sort of hoped it would be. So thanks.